The Babylon Project was our last best hope for sci-fi, a self-contained podcast 1 hour long located on the internet, a place of fun and discussion for Babylon 5 fans everywhere, a shining beacon in cyberspace, all alone in the night. It was the dawn of the 20th anniversary of Babylon 5, the year the Great War to free Bab 5 came upon us all. This is a story of the last of the Babylon podcast. The year is 2016. The name of the place is the Babylon Project Podcast.
This is Maggie Egan, your ISN news anchor, and you're listening to the Babylon Project podcast.
Hi there, Babylon 5 fans. Welcome to another fun, for us, evening at least, of the Babylon Project podcast. This is Raul Wybera, and I am here with my good friend Jim Arrowwood. How are you tonight, Jim?
I'm great.
And you know what, folks? We are joined in the studio with our official Babylon 5 military consultant, JP Harvey. How are you, sir?
Fine, gentlemen. How are you?
Great. Glad to have you here, JP.
Thanks. Good to be here.
Now, with our military consultant here, I bet that gives a hint that we will be talking about one of the more military-focused episodes, and that is correct. Tonight, we will be talking about Gropos.
And what does Gropos mean, for crying out loud?
Gropos is, at least in the series, short for ground pounder.
Ground pounder.
Yeah, and I think that's the first question for JP. Do they actually use that phrase anywhere in the military?
No, I had never heard that before Babylon 5. It's creative.
Oh.
That was a question my wife made me promise to ask.
Ground pounder is common in the lexicon, the jargon, but not Gropos.
Oh, okay. Because I've heard of ground pounders before. I believe they would be officially called infantry.
Right, or as we call them in the Air Force, professional pedestrians.
Ah.
Oh, gosh. Well, I think before we get in too far, Jim, would you mind giving us a recap?
All right, here it is.
Archive. Access. Initiated.
General Richard Franklin arrives at Babylon 5 with weapon upgrades for the station, as well as 25,000 infantry troops, also known as ground pounders or Gropos, that are to be billeted for a stop on their way to Io. But unknown to the troops, they are actually on their way to an assault operation to quell a civil war on the planet Actor. At the urging of Ivanova, Dr. Franklin attempts and finally succeeds in making amends with his estranged father, General Franklin. Meanwhile, Lieutenant Keffer is surprised by the arrival of two roommates from the Gropos, Privates Large and Yang. After some initial tension, the three become friends. Garibaldi also encounters Private Dodger, a female ground pounder that is just looking for a good time. The top-secret operation on Actor is a success, but the cost is high. In the closing scenes, Large, Yang, and Dodger have all three been killed in action.
Character. Files. Opened.
All right, thank you, Jim.
You're very welcome. Glad to do it.
As you always seem to have to remind me, you want to talk about guest cast?
Let's talk about guest cast. We had Mr. Paul Winfield as General Richard Franklin. This is his only appearance on Babylon 5, and he has credits dating all the way back to 1965.
This guy's been in a lot.
Oh, yeah. He's been, for us geeky type people, Wrath of Khan. He was Captain Terrell. He was in The Terminator, Lieutenant Ed Traxler, and in Next Generation, he was Darmok. In Darmok, he was Dathan, Captain Dathan.
Yeah, but that doesn't matter. Wrath of Khan, Terrell, yeah.
Sorry. Darmok was a good episode. Do you have any particular memories of him, JP, at all?
I do from Terminator, not from Trek. I'd have to go back and watch TNG, I think, to refresh my memory.
No, go back and rewatch Wrath of Khan.
Oh, watch both.
You know, just as an aside, and I know this is not a Star Trek podcast, but I'm still going to say it. If I had to make a list of my top 5 favorite science fiction movies of all time, not the most important like I did for the Sci-Fi Diner, but my favorite, Wrath of Khan would be probably in the number 1 or number 2 slot.
Oh, wow.
I think it is one of the best science fiction movies of all time.
Yeah, it's great. All right, so then we have also David Crowley as Lou Welch. We've talked about him before.
Many a time.
Yes. And we have Ryan Cutrona as Sergeant Major Plug, or Plug, I guess. I'm not sure how that would be pronounced. Also, his only appearance on Babylon 5 credits back to 1963. He was in Alien Nation and did some appearances on X-Files.
Yep.
And I don't remember seeing this guy in a whole lot of stuff. So
he's been around a lot, but not a lot of the stuff that we've necessarily watched.
Right. And then we have Ken Foree. He's probably a jolly good fellow, right? Okay, cue the crickets. All right, so at any rate, Ken Foree as Private First Class Turnbow / his nickname was Large, and he is.
Quite.
Yes. This is his only appearance on Babylon 5. Credits back also to 1963. And he's been on A-Team, Knight Rider, Quantum Leap, and X-Files. And on IMDb, there was a really neat quote that I think would perfectly fit this guy. He is large, likable, and muscular.
Yeah. Yeah, that would sum it up.
Yeah, very first line on IMDb.
I've seen him in a few of the stuff that he's done, in fact.
Okay, Morgan Hunter as Private Kleist, only appearance on Babylon 5, credits back to 1989, and they end in 2001, and he was also on Lois and Clark.
Did he retire, or do you know? Or
it doesn't say. It just doesn't list any work for him. Okay, Marie Marshall as Elizabeth Derman, who is called Dodger, Private First Class Dodger.
Right.
2 appearances on Babylon 5. She was also in the episode, 5th season episode, I believe, Day of the Dead.
Yeah.
Okay. And she...
Creepy episode.
Yeah. She was in Star Trek Next Generation in the episode called Starship Mine. She was Kelsey. Do either one of you remember what that episode was?
I don't.
Okay. Tim Russ was also in that episode as a human, and they had to evacuate the Enterprise because they had to do what's called a baryon sweep.
I remember that episode. Okay, I remember this.
Well, she was the head crook trying to steal that.
Trying to steal the Enterprise.
That plasma. No, just the warp plasma.
Okay, yeah.
And Picard was all by himself. So, okay. And then we have featuring Art. Oh, this is going to be tough. Art Chudabala as Private Yang, or Yang.
Yang.
Yeah. His only appearance on Babylon 5, credits back to 1989. He was on Deep Space Nine for 2 appearances and was in War of the Worlds in 2005.
Right.
Joshua Cox, Tech number 1. He has a pile of appearances on Babylon 5. I didn't even bother to count. Most of them
he becomes eventually... I mean, he's not on the opening credits, but he's more or less a series regular. At least, I mean, he's more than just a mere recurring role.
Right. He's credited mostly as either Tech 1 or Lieutenant Corwin.
Uh-huh.
And then we have Maggie Egan as Jane. No intro needed there.
Our favorite newscaster lady.
Right. And Moava Pryor as Tanya Wallace, who was the correspondent. This was her only appearance on Babylon 5. So that is our guest cast for this episode.
Yeah, and she's not got a whole lot of credits.
No, she doesn't have a great deal.
Initiating plot analysis.
Okay. You know, about this episode, when it starts, the one thing I've got to say right out the bat, Corwin is a total wet bucket. It's always dark in space. Time is a meaningless concept. Oh, come on. Now, I like philosophy, but I'm not even that much of a downer.
Well, you know what? And I don't know, maybe JP, you'll agree with me. As soon as Ivanova comes on and says, "Oh, look how nice and quiet it is, and we can just sit here," you know something is going to happen.
Well, and she's typically wound up about something, so start the show with her reclining in a chair and relaxing, something or somebody had to spoil that.
Yeah, you knew that, and it sure wasn't long.
No, it was a whole lot of something's coming up there.
Yeah.
So General Franklin serves as a surprise hello in the middle of the night.
Yep, and Susan says, "There's always something."
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
In this case, it turns out to be about 25,000 somethings.
Yes, and those are the ground pounders or the soldiers. The station is informed that they're going to be there whether they like it or not.
All right, then this is my first JP question.
I'm ready.
Is it even conceivable that they would dump that many military on a base or on a facility with no heads-up warning like they did there?
I think it would be unusual. We learned quickly that this is a secret mission. The fact that the ship came out there might have been concealed from the station if this were reality, but more than likely they'd be told they were passing through on an exercise. Something else was going on, and then you'd get the surprise secret briefing once they arrive. The 25,000, that would be large by today's standards for a division, and that's a 10% increase in the population on Babylon 5, right? They're 250,000, I think, is the intro.
Right there.
So that's a large group of guests. The one strange thing about how that was done to me is not that the general wants his guys to have shore leave, essentially. It's that the expectation seems to be that they all get off the ship at the same time and not be on the ship, and I think that's a little unusual. If Babylon 5 says, "Hey, we could bill at half your people," or something like that, the assumption is they'd set up a rotation. Folks would get some shore leave time, the others are staying on the ship, and then they would swap out. It may not be half. I'm just using that as an example.
Right.
That was, I don't know why JMS did that, because it wasn't realistic to me, other than it did set the immediate stage for General Franklin's personality.
Yeah.
So maybe you suspend disbelief a little bit, and he's really introducing the general.
Right.
Yeah. Okay. I will say one other thing with the docking sequence. They brought the transports in. Considering that you had to match rotation so tightly, that was some mighty impressive piloting, because there was not much room for error for those landing craft.
Do they actually control those ships, or does the station tractor them in somehow?
Well, it doesn't tractor them in because there's too many times where there's been, and it seems to usually be the Narn that panic and fire thrusters in the docking bay. Now, the station might slave the attitude controls to the station so that they can match, they can match angle.
Oh, okay.
Match the angular momentum.
Huh.
But
with the technology of the day, it seems they would be able to link their guidance systems or something.
Yeah.
Yeah. When you look at the technology going into our aircraft today, or some of the self-guiding car, well, maybe I shouldn't mention self-driving cars because they've been having wrecks lately. But I was going to say, disembarking, those transports lands and they disembark, the people you see marching off. I don't know if you've listened to the commentaries on this, but those are the same, I think, dozen or 24 people walking in a loop.
Oh, yeah.
They walk across the camera, loop back around, and come back on again.
Yeah.
And they just mat them across. And my wife has kind of gotten in the habit ever since she's learned that she snoops around and tries to figure out, match up the heads.
My grandfather was a West Point graduate. Not that this is what JMS was doing. He's just keeping the number of paid actors low, I suspect. But my grandfather used to say, they invented lines at West Point so that people could stand in them. That went through my head as you watch the lines of the same actors just walking in circles to look like a lot of people.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. And I can sympathize with that statement, JP, because when I was in basic training, we were in the reception area at Fort Jackson waiting to go to Tank Hill. I'm sure you've heard of that place. And
right.
We waited for about 6 hours before they finally loaded us up and took us up to Tank Hill. So waiting in line, yes, that's what we were living for. So anyway, you have here General Franklin knew Mike's father when he introduces himself.
Yes, when Mike shoots off his mouth, thinking he's not going to be heard.
Yeah.
I think that was a very nice little payback on General Franklin's part.
Well, I can sure understand where Mike is coming from. I mean, we are going to billet 25,000 rowdy people that have been pent up in transports for who knows how long, and Mike is expecting trouble.
Yeah.
And just justifiably so, I think.
Oh, yeah, no doubt about that, but you would have thought by now he would have learned to keep his mouth shut if there might be a senior officer nearby that could possibly overhear you.
Yeah, then he wouldn't be Garibaldi.
Well, it turns out that Earth is planning a surprise alliance and attack, and the story is that they're being called a relief troop for Io.
Yeah.
Now, JP, this kind of fits back in with what you were saying. There would have been some sort of cover story, but the senior command would have at least been given some hint or warning or notification that there were people coming.
Right, and that would be the story that they would be given.
And then you've got the real briefing and the background of what the need-to-know side.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
And that same story presumably would be distributed out to the ambassadors and the normal occupants, the citizens of Babylon
Right.
5. Hey, get ready. We've got this relief ship coming through. They're going to do some shore leave here, what have you. And people would complain about it, but they wouldn't pay a lot of attention to it, but I presume.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. Now, the other piece coming out of this, apparently Babylon 5 is getting its defenses upgraded. We've seen it in a combat situation before, like against the Raiders, and it seemed to do okay. But apparently this is going to be a pretty significant upgrade.
Yeah. And it's almost presented as kind of a bribe to help Sheridan accept this this billet.
Yeah.
The nature of General Franklin doesn't seem to be one that offers bribes. JP, have you ever known an officer like this man?
No.
Okay.
Like Franklin.
Right.
Right.
I've known some senior officers and some senior enlisted that have gruff attitudes.
Right.
Or abrasive personalities, but no, this guy was, to me, it was almost a caricature. I was going to say a caricature of the character that he is. That's probably using the words wrong, but he was a little bit of a cartoon.
Yeah. Now, have you noticed, JP, that happens an awful lot on television and in movies?
Kind of playing the stereotype.
Yeah.
It does. It does.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. It happens in the engineering and medical fields, too.
Unless it's a movie about the military, if it's another story that has a military piece to it, you can only go so deep. And if you want the audience to quickly identify with what you're trying to do in the story, I think you're going to end up seeing a sort of a stereotypical representation of whatever that piece of the military is, whether it's the angry, gruff old general or the crusty NCO or the stupid lieutenant, or all these stereotypes exist.
Okay.
The most recent one, not to get off topic here, but you'll notice if you haven't already, that almost every TV show or movie that has a military character in it that is not a military movie or story, that character has some form of PTSD.
Huh.
It's become...
especially today.
Right. So...
yep.
It's not the case, but that's how it is in TV and film.
Yeah.
And it seems that part of the stereotype is that General Franklin has pretty much taken over the station, it seems. And like you had said earlier, JP, that, was a 10% increase in population.
Well, this guy's got a lot of weight to throw around, and he's obviously not afraid to do it.
He's got his mission.
Yes.
Yeah.
I thought this was a neat, contrast, though, to the interaction of the two senior officers in the last episode that I was on, where there was instant hostility and challenges to authority. And in this case, the general walks on board. Of course, Sheridan is deferential to the fact that he's a general officer, but the two seem to kind of understand each other's territory. There's not all the questioning that went on and the suspicion that went on the last time with, I can't remember the captain's name that came in it was part two of...
It was part 2 of Voice in the Wilderness. Voice
in the Wilderness, right. Those two seemed to be two dogs that didn't want to get along.
Right.
To me, it seemed a greater level of respect between these two officers on this show. Sheridan doesn't like what's happening, but he doesn't seem to have a problem with the general.
Right.
Well, if nothing else, Franklin, just the general nature of the character, you just cannot imagine Franklin being a Clark crony, the way that other captain was, or have the contact. Remember, it turned out there was some sort of connection with the Psi Corps, I believe.
Yeah. Yep.
Yeah.
Or was that him?
I think it was.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Now, I will say this. I have to say this now, because in Billeting the People, Keffer walks into his quarters and finds Large and Yang there. And
right.
I have to say, I really like the Large. I really like Large. Great character.
I was expecting a fight to break out.
Yeah. Keffer played it right.
Hey, we can deal with this face to face when I get a ladder, or whatever his comment was.
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
Now,
I've been rather public about not being a big fan of the Keffer character, but I will say this was by far his best episode in the series. I really liked him in it.
Yeah. Well, and I do like him. I don't have a problem with him. He has a problem with a couple of guys showing up in his quarters, which I kind of don't blame him. He is, after all, a squadron leader.
Yeah.
And they have put a couple of enlisted personnel in his quarters. And to me, that seems a little outrageous.
And again, that may be for storytelling purposes.
Another
one of those odd deviations.
Yeah, I think I'm sure that was a story device that they used there.
Mm-hmm. Now, JP, how much experience do you have with senior officers in private life? You said your dad was from West Point, right?
Grandfather.
Okay, grandfather, not father.
Right. My grandfather, World War II generation guy, was a West Point graduate, a career Army and then Air Force officer. The Air Force stood up while he was on active duty after World War II. And my father was also a career Air Force officer.
Oh, good. You're just the man we want to talk to then, because when the general is saying hello to Stephen. He's more or less might as well be doing a glove inspection, a white glove inspection on his quarter. I almost got a bear on his quarters. And the whole conversation, you can get that sense of broken glass that they're walking on.
Right.
But that kind of relationship interaction, have you grew up as a kid with a career officer, then, from what you've said.
Right.
Is that, are we looking at more Hollywood here?
Yeah, I think this is more Hollywood. I can't. So I grew up with my dad born on an Air Force base. Dad was active duty the entire time that I was a kid, all the way up through college. He's the one that commissioned me in the Air Force. Oh, wow. And so I say all that to tell you this, that those years, those 18, 19, 20, 21, 22 years of childhood or young adulthood, obviously living in a community of people like me as a dependent. And none of my friends' parents were that way either, or their relationships. And I had a lot of friends that went in the service as well. You grow up in it and you say, I guess I'll do what dad does, or I'll do what mom does, and off you go. So this was a little bit of Hollywood.
Yeah. So when your dad came home from work, he took his uniform off. He took his uniform off and just became dad.
For the most part.
Yeah.
He had the personality that he had. Well, here's a story. I didn't talk a lot about my dad, who was a general officer, by the way. Didn't talk a lot about him openly unless I was talking with friends, and it would be reasonable in any other context that they would happen to know what my dad did, and then it would come up. Occasionally, I would run into people as a junior officer who knew my dad, and they would say, wait a minute, are you his son? And I wouldn't hide the fact. So proud of dad, but you don't want to go around, and especially you don't want a misunderstanding to happen. But I had one friend who, after my dad came out to promote me, I think to captain, and family was there a few days, and then I left. I went back to work. One of my friends said, that was so cool. I didn't know that your dad was a general. And I said, well, yeah, I don't boast about it, but I love him and I'm proud of him. And he goes, what do you call him?
At work or at home?
And I said, what do you mean, what do I call him? And he said, what do you call him? And I said, I call him Dad. What do you call your dad? But, so Raul, you just hit on something, though. When we were in uniform, in public, he was General Harvey.
Mm-hmm. Uh-huh.
And all the appropriate customs and courtesies were rendered.
As it should be.
Sirs and salutes. The only time after he commissioned me, after he promoted me each time, here's these two officers in uniform, and we would hug each other on stage. Nobody would mind that, otherwise it would be called a public display of affection. Because this is a father and son. But outside of those odd moments, that's a general and a subordinate officer. At home, he's dad.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's so I felt I had a heavy heart watching the Franklins story unfold. I'm sure that there were people out there, kids who came into the service with parents everywhere. That were, but I just really didn't know any of them. It certainly wasn't me and my father, or me and my grandfather.
Now, at the risk of jumping ahead, if I could for just a moment, what about the emotional side where, if your father was active, when he would deploy?
Most of his deployments happened when I was a little kid. And the primary one was Vietnam. And I can remember when he was gone, but I didn't appreciate the gravity of that as a kid. The more interesting question, and it's not one I can answer, is how did he deal with it when I deployed?
Or what about your own kids?
Right. Well, I have one, and he's still a child, so we'll see. Well, I can answer that question later. Yeah. But I know as a dad, as you guys are, there's that some volume of just natural protectiveness of your kids. And I can imagine my son growing up and going into the service, but I don't know how I'll feel if he's often in harm's way doing his job. Other than, I just don't know what that's going to be like.
As a dad who has 2 grown-up kids, I can tell you that right now that you never stop being dad and wanting to protect your kids.
Right.
So
I believe that.
Okay. Well, General Franklin, you've noted here, Raul, leans a bit isolationist, and I think it's more than a bit.
Yeah, it wasn't explicitly said, but I wouldn't call him someone who would be part of Homefront or something like that, but definitely very conservative as far as his interaction with the rest of the galaxy is concerned.
Yeah.
Or I guess a better word for that would be provincial.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. After his little bit of clash, because of course, when everyone's walking on glass like that, it's going to fall apart. Mm-hmm. Stephen Franklin is definitely a bit on the cranky side with Susan.
Well,
he's kind of in a resent the military frame of mind.
I don't think it's Susan in particular that he is upset with. He's upset with his dad, and secondly, he ain't real happy that they're going to billet ground pounders in his med lab.
That was a part that really seemed to stretch for me.
Well, yeah, but now, as far as a TV show is concerned and a science fiction TV show is concerned, I'm sure all 3 of us will agree that above the captain is the doctor, and the doctor is in command in their infirmary. Yeah. And nobody tells them what to do in there.
Yeah, at least in TV. I don't know about real life.
Well, and see, this may be a little closer to real life because Franklin's going to do what he's told, whether he likes it or not.
But I will say this: when I was at my other company, when I was in Southern Cal, I had a PA that worked for me, one of my clinical scientists, and she also happened to be an Air Force colonel in the medical corps. And from some of the from some of the stories that she said, when it was in the context of her duty as a doctor, she was God. Now, I don't know if that corresponds with JP's experience or not, but that, at least from what I saw, it didn't seem terribly overstated.
Well, I'll tell you what, when I was in the Army, I was in the hospital. I had an appendectomy, and the nurses were all lieutenants, but they barked like generals. Let me tell you.
That has nothing to do with them being in the military. I've worked with enough, especially CCU nurses. That's their nature.
Yeah.
You don't stand between a nurse and her patient, and I've seen, and this is entirely civilian. I have seen nurses grab a doc, pull him aside out of patient's hearing, of course, and give them a total rip down because of bad attitude or not taking care of doing what was best, necessarily in her opinion, for the patient.
I've never seen that.
Well, like I said, you'd have to be in the inside because this is kept away from the patients. But those nurses don't get in the way of them and their patients.
I'll tell you what, one day I thought I was feeling really, really good a few days after this surgery, and I went down to the recreation room, and they said, "Where are you going?" I said, "I'm going down to the rec room, play some cards." And I got down there, and there was nobody to play cards with, and then someone says, "Hey, you want to play some ping pong?" And so I said, "Yeah, sure." So I started playing ping pong and tore my incision open. And when I got back up to the floor and walked in, I heard about it. Let me tell you, I got a good dressing down for that. And I suppose I had it coming. Now Susan, of course, Franklin is going off on Susan, and Susan does something that would be, I don't know, she did it very well, but she asked Franklin nicely to allow these soldiers to stay in med lab, and it kind of calmed him down a little bit.
Yeah. and, with her conversation with him, she kind of gets the idea. She can relate to him from the other side, of course, because her dad didn't want her to serve, but she can relate to it, and she gives him a real good piece of advice to put the grievances to bed with his father before it's too late.
Mm-hmm.
And Stephen can read between the lines.
Yes. Now we get a really ugly kind of a scene.
Yes, the attack on Delenn, which I'll say this and then I'll qualify it. It struck me as rather contrived, but not from a plot's perspective by the guy. He was out intentionally looking for trouble.
Oh yeah, because he comes back again later looking for more trouble. He gets it finally.
Yep. And I'll say this: the Dodger certainly can seem capable of handling herself. Garibaldi kind of saves her there, but then they run into the real danger, Sergeant Major.
Yeah.
I thought that scene with Delenn, when it first happened, I questioned why it was in there.
So, okay, Jim, you are Army, so I'll ask this one.
Uh-huh.
How realistic versus how Hollywood was that guy?
Oh, he was completely Hollywood.
Yeah.
I never met anyone who was like that when I was in the Army at all. I only saw our Sergeant Major for our company one time. Mostly I dealt with our first sergeant, and he was a good guy. He would jump you when you had it coming, but he was, he wasn't, the name calling and stuff like that didn't really go on. But that stuff was starting to go away when I was in the Army. They were trying to get some of that cut down. Yeah.
Okay. Now, I did have a friend who was in the Marines who...
Oh, I'm not saying... not saying we didn't have tough sergeants. We had to have tough sergeants. But they were also human beings, too.
Uh-huh.
So, when it was appropriate, they might be gruff, but only when it was appropriate. Yeah.
Right. And by the way, the gal's name, Dodger, Garibaldi's second favorite thing in the universe,
I
Dodger.
don't know if I'd go that far.
They made sure to show the poster over his bed.
Well, they have to, because if they panned over and it wasn't there, people would have let loose.
People would have, yep. People would have been enraged.
I don't know. It could be. I didn't read JMS's notes about it, and I don't know if he was asked about it.
This actually is probably the shortest Lurkers page in the entire series. Not a whole lot. Oh, my wife did notice one thing about it.
Yeah.
The initial meeting between the two. As Garibaldi's walking into the elevator, Dodger's comment, nice butt.
Yes.
Yeah, payback for all the Talia jokes.
Yeah. I wonder how many saw that actually got that.
I don't know. Probably a lot of the ladies. Which is what I think it was. I think that was one that JMS threw in for the ladies.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the general is getting briefed by Sheridan, and this attack is going to be a little messier than he thought.
Oh, yeah.
But he doesn't feel able to back out.
Right. Well, and General Franklin also told Sheridan that Sheridan was actually going to help him with the planning of the operation.
Yeah, at the outset.
Now, JP, we had a little issue the last time we recorded with you about how we were looking at things from primarily an American military perspective. A very valid point put forth by a good friend of mine over in England, Colin.
Oh, no, this was actually wasn't so much related to, this was connected with the, we can save that sidebar for the feedback episode, which will happen long before this. Well,
actually, I have a method for this because...
Okay, method for humanist. This was about the civilian, the senator.
Right.
interaction with the military.
Well, but what I'm going into is differences in the way things are done, procedural things in the military. Now, JP, can you help me out here for a minute? I read or heard or something that there's a different, in other places, there's a different kind of philosophical point of view as far as issuing orders is concerned. For instance, I was told this, I don't know if it's true, but here in the United States, they say, okay, this is our objective. Everybody plans, and they argue, and so forth and so on, and then orders are issued. And I've heard that in other military organizations, you get the orders issued, and then everybody argues about it, and then the orders are changed if they need to be. Have you ever encountered anything like that?
I think we're looking at the same thing from different points of view. When we plan for a contingency or combat ops, there are orders issued that start the planning. So there's guidance given up front. We need the military to be the tool or a tool among many to be put against a particular problem, whether it's combat or humanitarian assistance or whatever the issue is. So there are orders given to essentially to begin planning before any of the actual execution happens. In a crisis, that's sped up. Mm-hmm. And you could have elements of, if we're talking about military operations, you could have elements of the military that begin to act quickly, still given a limited set of orders or rules of engagement, if it's an engagement issue, or equivalent rules if it's not. While planning continues, and plans, you know the old adage, no plan survives contact with the enemy.
Yeah.
So you plan whatever that process looks like. If it's lengthy and deliberate, or if it's in a crisis, there's planning that goes on. People do what they do. The military does what it does, and you adjust along the way. It's almost it's not a process that starts and stops. It's a continuous adjustment or refinement. And if you have to actually issue a change to the orders, or we call it a fragmentary order, off of the main order, then you do that. So I think we're describing the same thing.
Okay.
You know, this brings up a point, though, that goes back to the earlier in the episode, the comment that General Franklin makes about the Senate.
Uh-huh.
Because remember that last episode, we had that oddity where there were people who I said wouldn't normally be considered in the chain of command, at least in the American system.
Right.
Apparently issuing orders. And in this case, General Franklin shows up, and he says, this is what, he doesn't say who ordered him to do it. He says, this is what we're doing. Sheridan doesn't seem to be troubled by that, the mission itself. He may be troubled by the impact it has on B5 or, on the greater sector or the region.
Right.
Have to speak as an American because that's my frame of reference. Our president, as all of us have seen, regardless of who sits in the White House, has the authority under the War Powers Act of 73, I think is when that was done, to deploy forces and to use them without the concurrence of Congress. But he has to gain approval within 90 days, or he has to withdraw the troops.
Right.
That's to allow him to operate as the commander-in-chief and to address a crisis or something that mandates a quick response, but it doesn't let him abuse the authority. The War Powers Act was a limitation placed on the presidents that were in office during the Vietnam War by Congress. They said, hey, you can't just deploy forces without our consent. We have a role in this too, checks and balances.
Yeah.
So it reinforced that historic relationship. Depending on who's in the seat and depending on what the mission is that the military is sent on, somebody's always happy and somebody's always not happy. So there's criticisms that happen in both directions. Or so this is an apolitical issue. If it's a a Republican president in the White House, there's going to be somebody, certainly even people in his own party, but on the other side, they aren't going to like the way he's using authority. And the same is true if it's a Democrat.
Oh, yeah.
So, those struggles go on. In this case, it was interesting to me that we have a general who comes in and he says, this is what I'm being told to do. And then basically says, my gross paraphrase, we're just waiting on the Senate to approve it. And I wondered if that was JMS suggesting that that's the way he thinks it should be. It is, and to an extent, it is the way it's supposed to be. We shouldn't be employing military force without the whole of government saying do it. But it's as if the president said go, the executive branch, the commander-in-chief says go, but he's respecting the fact that there's this pause while the Senate, I forget the language he used in the episode, so I'm going to use the word approves, and then they're going to be free to do certain things. I just thought that was an interesting unfolding.
I got the feeling that, and I wouldn't be surprised if the Senate had already been advised, at least the appropriate committees in the Senate had been advised of what was going on and had been part of the process, because you almost got the feel like they were wanting to do this as a rapid A, then B. Senate approves, move in. No time for anyone to question or know what's going on. They wanted the alliance to be as much of a surprise as the attack. So it was part of the timing. It was part of the timing for political purposes, as much as, if not more so, than the military purposes.
I would like to see a flow chart of the organization of the government in 2253, because if I recall correctly, I thought General Franklin said the Senate sent him to do this.
Yeah, I'd have to go back and listen. I didn't. I either didn't hear it. I didn't hear it that way. I thought he said he was waiting. He said they were waiting for the Senate decision.
Huh.
He had obviously already been sent, whether the Senate sent him or not. But he was waiting on some Senate action before he continued. I'd have to go back and look at that now.
And bear in mind, even though they call it a Senate, as Colin pointed out to us from the UK, that system is almost more of a parliamentary system than what we think of as our Republican, not party, but governmental style, as our Republican system that we have with our Senate.
That's why I say I would love to see a chart of how power is divided in Babylon 5's universe.
So when JMS calls in, we can ask him.
Hello, Mr. Straczynski. Still waiting for you.
That would be great.
Yep. Well, moving in, Stephen, shows up and just keeps the relationship tumbling downhill. Though after he leaves, we do kind of get to the heart of the general's hurt feelings.
Yeah.
And,
well, Stephen is not. They're both very stubborn people, and it doesn't seem like either one of them wants to give any ground whatsoever. And the general is definitely a bit terse and comes across, rather than being dad, he is, the commander. Even when we're dealing with a personal situation here. And Stephen makes that very clear as he salutes, and says, yes, sir, and then turns around and leaves.
Yeah.
Sad scene.
Yeah, it is.
Yep. And I think the best part of that, though, is the follow-up conversation where General Franklin and Sheridan have a little bit of a frank talk about it. And one of the parts that I had a personal liking to, JP, especially since you're from a military family. I would love to hear your thoughts on it. And this is Sheridan's Sheridan's philosophy of war, basically. I'll go ahead and play that.
Captain, when you destroyed the Black Star, did you feel like a murderer? It's not an easy question to answer.
I suppose the Minbari consider me one.
But the Minbari are not your own flesh and blood.
There's only one truth about war. People die. Killing is part of a soldier's job. We can't deny it. We can only live with it and hope the reasons for doing it are justified.
If only my son could realize that.
I'm going to throw that back over to you, JP. Your thoughts?
Yeah, I like what Sheridan said. In fact, it's something not quite as scripted as in a TV show that we try to teach our cadets and our enlisted troops as they come into the service. That's what was the Patton speech? The goal isn't to die for your country; it's to make the other poor guy die for his. Right.
Right.
But the fact is that officers and NCOs will spend the lives of their troops if they have to. And the general doesn't understand, I guess, his son, who wears a uniform but identifies himself as a physician first, a healer. And
yeah, and I have met some doctors who certainly do take that level of an approach.
I like that Sheridan, though, comes back around and defends Stephen Franklin by saying he's one of the finest doctors that I've ever known. And paints a picture, I think, of why somebody like this great medic is critical to what the military does.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Which maybe is a way to, instead of saying, look, be proud of your son, he's a great doctor, is your son, the great doctor, enables your ability, General, to fight the war.
Right. So then, JP, is Franklin in this situation, is he a doctor first or a soldier first?
I think he thinks
Not
of
from.
himself.
I don't think Jim is asking that from a personal basis. I think he's asking it from a legal basis.
Oh, okay.
Am I right, Jim?
I don't know. That I don't know. Our doctors, our military doctors, the ones that I know, I think of themselves as physicians in uniform, not soldiers or airmen or sailors or Marines who happen to be doctors.
Right.
Now, I'm sure somebody could hear me say that and call in and say I'm a doctor and I don't think of myself that way. But most of the medics that I've known and worked with, if you ask them what they do, the first thing that they say is medical. I'm a doctor in the Air Force, or I'm a nurse in the Air Force, or I'm a trauma surgeon in the Air Force. I mean, they identify with the medical piece of what they do.
Right.
That's completely consistent with the ones I know.
It is.
Yeah, that is completely consistent with the ones I know, and I've known several.
And that doesn't diminish their identity with the military. It's just a different. It's a different view.
Yeah.
Of the same.
Well,
thing.
see, and that would be where I would think it should. That's the way it should be. I mean, if a superior officer comes in and orders a doctor to do something that is not in his patient's best interest,
Or medically unethical.
right, then he would be giving in essence an illegal order, in which makes that doctor not obligated to follow that order.
Right. Yeah, there is no obligation to follow unlawful or immoral orders.
Right.
Now, there's ways to deal with that when it happens, not just in the medical world, but across the board. That's a whole nother show sometime, I think, is to, what happens when you're issued an order that you genuinely believe is illegal or immoral, unethical. You get into that bucket. What's your obligation?
I'm sure we'll hit that situation somewhere down the road.
We'll catch that soon enough. And JP, you're right in a more literal sense. It is another show.
Yeah.
One coming up in season 3.
Speaking of morals, okay, here comes Dodger.
Yeah.
Yeah. Looking for Garibaldi.
Yeah. As Anthea put it, she moves pretty fast.
Oh, gosh. Well,
Hey, No time to waste, right?
Yeah, well,
Going to war.
I think that was less of well, I don't know. I've heard some of my uncle's Navy stories on the one hand, but I think that's also as much of we've only got 60 or 45 minutes or so for the show itself.
Right. Well, not only that though. Okay, she's going to be deployed.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and as you said in the notes, Raul, it's painful to watch her being hurt.
Yeah.
Okay, but she's expecting Garibaldi to just forget all his hurt too. But at the same time, yeah, she's going way too fast for Garibaldi. In her mind, she's being deployed, and she, as she kind of alluded, she wants to just feel human once before she goes to combat.
Uh-huh. And as you say, Mike, as you say, Mike picks a hell of a time for a recap.
Yeah.
I believe is how you phrased it.
Yes.
Lou's line, everyone's going to bed, as they're hauling off the
yeah.
unconscious, right.
Mm-hmm.
Hey, Miss Connolly is mentioned.
Yep, she's still...
And I've noticed she gets mentioned a few times. She just never shows up again.
No, she's definitely somewhere doing her job and too busy to get on camera.
I still wish they would have brought her back more than once. That she was a great character.
Well, it would have been neat and consistent with the nature of the show, but, who knows? Maybe she just wasn't available.
Right. But what matters now is Babylon 5 is armed to the teeth.
Yes, we're ready to face, or try to face, the shadows at some point later on.
Mm-hmm. Or at least something on the par of a warship.
Yeah.
Yeah. Who was it? What rule in movies or in stage is that called? You don't show a gun in Act 2 unless you're going to use it before the climax.
Yeah.
Yeah. We'll definitely see that.
Yeah. Now, the next thing we get is all this tension that we've had between Stephen and his father. We get some idea where this come from, and we also get some resolution to this.
Yep. They finally really talk.
Well,
they both dance around the whole mission bit, but they actually really talk for the first time as father and son.
Is it so much that they really talk, or maybe they finally really listen?
Or both.
What you said.
Yeah.
What you said, Jim. And having talked to JP about this now, I'm going to put out my own theory, because one of my notes here says, when Franklin asks, is it that this is the way it is between all fathers and sons? No, it's not. But I'll tell you, since Antonio's born, the couple of times we've watched through this series together, that sure makes me want to put my arm around him and give him a hug. And I think JMS might be more using the military context as just a vehicle to get into the relationship between fathers and sons.
Yeah.
I think that might have been his real goal here.
Well, yeah. I have my own theories about relationships between fathers and sons, but I've got a 30-year-old son.
Right.
So, I can look back. I can remember how I got along with my dad, and I remember how Ben and I got along. And there is a point, and I don't think it's just fathers and sons, but I think it's children in general, where your kids get to a certain age where they look at you and say, you are the stupidest person that has ever walked the earth, and you have no idea how I feel, and you don't even care.
Mm-hmm.
Seriously. I know that, and then they come back to you a few years later and say, oh, I was really...
Boy, was I dumb.
Yeah. So, yeah, I know. When I was 15, 16 years old, I thought my dad was the dumbest man in the world. He had absolutely no idea what he was talking about,
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah. And I know my son probably.
So there is an aspect, you would say there is an aspect, there's some aspect of this between most, if not all, fathers and sons. As far as some degree of that disconnect.
And I've got a theory, and it's way off the subject of everything. And the theory just very briefly is children need to leave home at some point.
Right.
And if home is happy, they're not going to want to leave. So I actually think that our brains are hardwired to have this little conflict, so that you're like, I cannot wait to get out of here.
The Homo sapien version of a bird pushing the chick out of the nest.
There you go.
Yeah.
That's just what I was thinking.
It's hardwired into us for these kinds of situations that we got to get out. And so we get out on our own, and then we come back, and the relationship has changed. It's matured.
Right.
So,
okay.
In any case, it just seems like it took a real long time for Stephen and his father's relationship to mature.
Yeah. Yeah.
So.
Raul, my son, watched this sitting next to me when I went through it the last time.
Uh-huh.
And after this scene, and he was sitting a foot away from me on the couch, he scooted over and grabbed my arm and gave me a big hug.
Yeah.
Oh, that's neat.
And not because we're having a conflict. We haven't gotten to the teenage years yet. He's 8. But, totally happy sitting there watching the show. But when he saw that the change in the interaction with the Father Franklin and son Franklin, oh boy, he turned around and grabbed a hold of me.
Yeah.
It was pretty good.
I know firsthand what you're talking about, my friend. I know firsthand.
Oh, kids are really smart. They pick up on stuff really, really well. So anyway, we get back to Private Yang.
The bar. Yeah. He's a little scared. It's his first tour.
You darn right.
I could understand being scared.
Well, you know something? I don't care if it's a first deployment or a 31st deployment. I think a person going into combat or a combat situation is going to be scared.
That is exactly what Large says as well.
The respect for battle, for combat, which manifests as fear in my head, that doesn't ever go away. I think there would be something wrong with you if you weren't afraid of the environment that is war. There are things on a first deployment that add to that or amplify it because you just have never done it before. That piece changes. You go once, and then you go a second time, and the second time is different than the first time because now you've done it. But the fear associated with facing the enemy, at least for me, that fear, or what I'll call a healthy respect for the enemy, what they can do to you, that doesn't go away. You may grow in your own confidence of your own skills, as a combatant, but the enemy gets a vote, and you can't control that. So that fear, it just doesn't go away. But it is a different thing the first time than it is the second and every time after.
Well, it's that unknown factor that you're facing.
You know nothing. You just don't know.
It doesn't matter how much training. I remember this from basic training. I of course never deployed, but when you're training, it's training, and it can't possibly be the same as a real situation, because when you're training, somebody is not trying to kill you.
Right.
So
I have been. I was not in the military, so I never saw combat in that sense. But I did do a lot of martial arts training, and I have been living in Los Angeles, you can imagine. I have been in more than one for lack of a better phrase, self-defense situation.
Mm-hmm.
For real, where it's like, okay, enough so that those points where I had to be ready, and the fact that I was ready and committed to use my car to run over a person probably kept my wife from getting hurt. So yeah. I can kind of imagine the relation that what you guys are talking about.
Well, and it's another thing to be willing to do something. I had a job as a security officer at a power plant. I worked for a company, and then we lost our contract, and a new company came in, and they said, you will be carrying a sidearm on the job. And it was like, I don't want to work for you.
Mm-hmm.
Because I honestly did not know in that situation well, first of all, I didn't believe I needed a sidearm in that situation. And secondly, I don't know in my mind that if I could actually pull the trigger on somebody without ever being in that situation. Now I can use a 3-iron on them with no problem. But that's that's less permanent.
I think, and just because of the couple of situations that I've been in, this is one area where you will never see me in a barroom dressed up like we're about to get here.
Oh yeah,
because the style of martial art that I trained in and studied primarily was a style called Kempo.
Same here.
Then you know what I'm talking about, how Kempo teaches you to fight.
Well, you're taught to try to avoid a fight.
You're taught to try to avoid, you're taught to try to avoid the fight if at all possible.
Yes.
But when there's no other option, when you're put into the fight, when it's forced upon you,
you're very efficient at stopping it.
Yes, you do whatever is necessary to eliminate the threat.
Yeah, I've been there. At any rate, we got to move this show along.
We've got to move. It's been some fantastic side discussions.
Yeah.
And I know my wife is upstairs waiting too.
Oh. So anyway, Yang is scared.
Mike makes up with Dodger.
Yeah, and then Mike comes up with Dodger.
And people apparently seem to be suspicious about the mission.
About the real mission.
It's like, okay, this is not just a training mission to Io, is it? They wouldn't pull that. They wouldn't pull that CO out for something like that.
Well, I'll tell you what, and I can tell you from personal experience in the Army, and I'll bet you JP can do it too.
Yep.
You know something is going on, and the rumors start flying, and you get enlisted people, especially enlisted people that aren't in a loop, start making up stories. And the rumors fly, and pretty soon they sound pretty true.
Uh-huh.
Have you experienced that, JP?
Right. People offer opinions, and those opinions become, Sergeant Jones or Captain Jones says, here's what I think is going on, and that instantly becomes what's going on, even though it was opinion.
Yeah. See, I remember when we had... when I was in basic training, a North Korean sniper or North Korean rifleman shot across the border, and if I'm not mistaken, he either killed or severely wounded an officer on the South Korean side of the border. And I was at Fort Jackson at the time, and let me tell you, activity really stepped up that day.
Right, we're going to war, right?
We had choppers going over. We had tanks rolling by. We had, our drill sergeants their eyes were as big as saucers, and it was, we're going to war. And next thing you know, they're going to cut basic training down to 6 weeks from 9 weeks, and the rumors immediately started flying, and nothing like that even happened.
Huh.
So. What you've got here, I think, is a situation where nobody really actually knows what's going to be happening.
They're pretty sure they know what isn't happening, but that's all they know.
I wonder if that explains Kleist. Because Kleist is looking for a fight again.
Frustrated.
Yeah.
Or he's just that kind of an element. I mean, in every barracks, there's going to be one person who is just a disturber.
Every barracks has its Francis that needs to lighten up.
Yeah. I loved Garibaldi's line. I'm getting too old for this crap.
Now, I will say this. This is one of, I sort of quote my stories. And JP, were you ever in Southern Cal, Los Angeles area by any chance?
I've been down there, but not for work.
El Toro?
No, not there.
Okay. There was, in El Toro, there were definitely some of those kind of dust-ups between the Navy and the Marine guys.
Right.
But they had a neutral place. Even if you were in uniform, it was like neutral territory. You don't do anything to start trouble there. In fact, I had seen some Marine guys kind of get on one of their own and kind of usher him out because he was getting a little bit rowdy. I was a place called The Barn. Fantastic little restaurant. It really was an old barn that had been turned into a restaurant. But yeah, they had those. It was a neutral spot. I'll put it that way.
Everyone knew it.
And everyone knew it. And they pretty much enforced it themselves because they didn't want to blow a good thing.
Yeah. Well, there's always going to be a loudmouth around somewhere.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and they're going to stir the pot.
Yeah, and of course this was tension between the Navy and the Marines, in particular the Navy and Marine pilots. Yeah. I don't know if that particular competition was a little more intense than between some of the other branches of service or not. What might as well, JP, what kind of experience was your interaction between the different branches?
Branches of the military or within the Air Force?
Either or.
Well, they're in the Army and in the Air Force. There are kind of the prime communities, I guess. The top of the heap folks in the Air Force. Historically, there was what we lovingly refer to as the bomber mafia. Right, tracks back to World War II, and the bomber pilots kind of ran the Air Force, and these days it's more of the fighter mafia. Oddly, our fighter pilots drop a lot of bombs, so I guess you could argue that it's still really the bomber mafia. But you know and then there's the helicopter guys like me who would get picked on, and you can't fly fast, and your nose bleeds above 50 feet. And stuff like that. But honestly, the ribbing that goes on between these communities, or between the pilots and the navigators, pilots as a community and navigators, or rated officers versus non, or you can slice the pie up 100 ways. Really all of that ribbing that goes on is is like brothers.
Right.
Again, my experience. Every community's got their slice of jerks, but when it's all said and done, I think there's the shared respect among the family is greater than any real genuine dislike. I haven't seen it. And it goes on between the services too. My colleagues in the Army, they pick on us and we pick on them, and we go out as Air Force guys and we're Navy ship qualified, deck qualified, and but the Army is too, segment of their aviation community. So then we'll get into spats over who does it better. And of course, the Navy says all you guys are rookie. It just, that banter goes back and forth, but it's brothers and sisters, or fraternal, or if there's a sorority version, the sororital, or
right.
It's family in the end, and it gets heated sometimes, usually because of alcohol, or something like that. I suppose people get out of control, but 28 years of service taught me that I think we all really do believe we're on the same team.
Mm-hmm. No one forgets what side they're on.
No, when it comes down to it, we may beat each other up a little bit, but as soon as the enemy walks into the camp, there's no division among us.
All differences get dropped very quickly.
Yep. Right.
So the troops get deployed, and we get the people looping again. Like I said, Anthea watches for the repeats.
Yeah.
It seems the sergeant major keeps the discipline, but a little bit of leniency where Dodger is, I'd say.
And you asked me earlier about the sergeant major, and it just seems like he seems like an aide to the general, which is very possible. I mean, a sergeant major, that's, let's see, there above the sergeant major, there would be a command sergeant major, and then I believe sergeant major of the Army, and that would be the top enlisted rank, at least in the Army. And so he's aiding the general, but he is also keeping troops in line by himself, and this is not a realistic situation.
Right.
So
this is a division they've shrunk down to 4 guys or 5 guys for the sake of telling the story.
Right. So it's not accurate. I understand what they're doing, but that sergeant major would actually be telling platoon sergeants that, hey, this is getting out of hand, and you need to get your people together, or we're going to come after you.
Right.
So,
right.
Because I didn't see any other non-com officers other than the sergeant major.
No.
So,
when you have a sergeant major like that guy, you only need one, right?
Yeah, I guess. Get your stroking aces going here. I tell you what, the guy's language just cracks me up.
Well, they were restricted. On the one hand, they wanted him to sound rougher, but on the other hand, they were kind of restricted by what they could say.
Yeah.
So that more or less wraps up the main story, and what comes afterwards is sort of an epilogue.
Yeah.
And it starts out with our news lady.
Yay, Maggie.
The great Maggie.
Yeah.
Let me go ahead and play her quote.
We now go live to Octor.
So we get her bringing us to a live feed from the planet.
Yeah.
That they're there to take. And Jim, you said something about a outtake on this.
Yeah. I contacted Troy Rudder, as I often do, to see if he has any interesting anecdotes or any interesting stories that go with the shows. And he immediately sent me a response that had this blooper in it.
We now go live to Octor.
That was the original, and here's the blooper.
We now go live to Actor. Actor? I'm not an actor.
Okay.
So that's on YouTube, and if we can get the link to the show in the show notes, that would be kind of neat.
I'll definitely try and do that. And I'm sorry for the delay, Jim. We're gonna break the fourth wall for just a moment here.
Okay.
My Facebook just bleeped at me.
Yeah.
And where you say I make this comment about we just need to get Marshall to chat with us in the podcast.
Yeah.
And you say good idea. What say you, Mr. Teague?
Yeah.
Well, Mr. Teague just popped back the message, absolutely.
Oh. So, okay, well, I'll get in touch with him and see what we can arrange.
Sorry about that. I just had to break in for that bit of news.
Cool. All right. So at any rate.
Well, Maggie brings us to Actor, and I will say this was not what you would expect out of most Hollywood shows.
No.
Because nobody that you cared about survived. And it was just emotionally crushing. Those were my wife's words.
It was a gruesome scene. And I remember first watching it, and there's no real words for it. You just kind of sit there with your mouth open watching this. And, you know, and it amazes me how quickly you get to care about these characters.
He cast it and he wrote it brilliantly to get get you invested that quickly.
Yeah. I mean, here we have 46 minutes of show.
Uh-huh.
And we're not even at 46 minutes yet. You know, we're at about 40 minutes.
And the fact that he does that so well is what makes that final scene so impacting.
Yeah. What did you think of that scene, JP?
I thought it reinforced Sheridan's words earlier when he was talking with the general. There's only one truth about war: people die.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So he being Straczynski, I think he brought the whole thing full circle back to that point. Not that would be the only point he was making in the show, I don't think, but I suspect he wanted us to leave this episode with that in our heads.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And he didn't just say it. It's not philosophy.
Well, even with that,
and then we just watch characters die. I'm sorry, Jim.
Even without that, with that knowledge, I don't think a person is ever going to be completely prepared for something like that.
Well, I agree.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, you can say you're prepared and you can pretend, but when your friends go off and, you know, well, there's a possibility that you're not going to come back, you don't actually believe that. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So
right.
Just a thought.
And a good one. Yeah. And, you know, it's like the idea that even a just war has a price.
Anything that is worth doing is going to have a price attached.
Mm-hmm. And you know, this is kind of why we're going to give JP the last word on this, especially now as we're having to swing into wrap up. I really like and respect, as a private citizen, one who's never had to serve, I like and respect how he presents war from the perspective of the horror and the loathing of it. I think he probably did about as good a job as a civilian ever could of trying to get those ideas across, but he also gets the inevitability and sometimes even the necessity. I mean, at the end of the day, make sure, be certain if war's got to happen, be certain that it's just.
Yeah. I always remember, though, an exchange between Carl Malden and George C. Scott and Patton, where Carl Malden was playing Omar Bradley. And, they were talking about, I guess you could call it a kind of a philosophy of war. And Carl Malden Omar Bradley tells George Patton, I do this job because I'm trained to do it. You do it because you love it. So, a difference in philosophy. Now, I don't know how true to real life that was. I read Omar Bradley's book, and he had plenty to say about Patton, but he never said that in his book. But
a little Hollywood.
Yeah, it seems to me that would be it. Most of Bradley's stories about Patton were actually rather humorous. But
yeah. I will say this, and I'm saying this as someone who's been non-military. Like I said, I've been in the situation more than once where I've had to honestly, not just simply ask myself, but be ready and willing to defend my life or my wife's life. I cannot the one thing I do understand is how that cannot be anywhere near the intense or what it does to the mind of someone who's having to face an entire army of people whose job is to try and kill you. If you follow what I mean.
I don't know if it's how accurate it is, but watch the opening scenes of Saving Private Ryan.
Mm-hmm.
I have been told by veterans that comes really, really close.
Yeah. Well, JP, we're going to give some of the last words on this to you, as far as your thoughts.
Yeah, I don't know anybody who, Jim, what was the phrase you said? You do this because you love it. Yeah, I don't know if that's true or not either. I don't know anybody who has seen combat that loves it. It's just a horrible thing. That said, the community, the brotherhood that emerges because of that shared ugly experience I don't know where else you would find that. It's a wonderful thing that comes out of the ugliest of environments. And there are people that get lost in that. If you guys haven't seen American Sniper, I think that was depicted really well as you watch him go through multiple deployments, and it gets to where he identifies with his brothers in the field more than his own wife and kids. That's not healthy, obviously, but there are things that are amazing and wonderful about combat that manifest in the form of, that brotherhood or that sisterhood. But boy, war is ugly. And I would be willing to say, that any healthy career soldier or not career, so using soldier generically, is really the first person in society who would speak up and say that they hate war the most. They're trained to do it. They have a role to do. They'll trust in their training and they'll respond and get the job done. But they're the last people that want to see it happen. And I include myself in that. That's not just me talking philosophically. That's me and the people that I know. We're ready to do our jobs, and we're going to be good at it. That's the promise to the people that we serve. But we don't want to have to do our jobs. I'd rather be home with my wife.
Yeah.
So that's combat. JMS did a good job. I've known a few people in the military, and I don't think I've ever seen anyone who hates war more than a career officer, career soldier.
Right. And especially once you taste it. And, we're like everybody else, right? Military guys, military gals. We're going to tell stories, and we're going to highlight the amazing things and the heroics and all of that, but that doesn't mean that you really liked it.
Yeah.
That's a part of what lets you go to work every day, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
We're going to win the Super Bowl. I might get a broken leg, might get a concussion, but we're the best, Well, now apply that on the scale of the military.
Yeah.
That's how you get to work.
Well, this episode went a little bit longer, I think, than we actually planned, but it was really neat.
And I think it was worthwhile.
It was a lot of fun.
I think it was very worthwhile.
Well, JP, as always, thank you for joining us.
Yes, sir.
And thank you for what you've done for our country, honestly, and especially talking to you over the last almost couple hours.
I think we can say that's unanimous.
I really hope that this gives some insight to the mind and heart and soul of our soldiers, to our listeners as well.
Oh, well, I hope
and
so.
Along with our military personnel, let's not forget police officers, firefighters, medical workers.
All of our uniformed service.
Yeah. So anyway, did we have some boom today?
I think there was a little bit.
I think there was some boom.
Some boom?
I think there was some boom.
Think we'll get more boom tomorrow?
Oh, yes. There's always a boom tomorrow.
There's always boom tomorrow.
Good night, everyone.
Podcast terminated. Thank you for listening to the Babylon Project podcast. You can email Raul and Jim at the Babylon Project podcast at gmail.com. You can find us on Facebook at the Babylon Project Podcast. On the internet, we are at babylonprojectpodcast.wordpress.com. To subscribe to the podcast, you can find us on iTunes, or you can subscribe to the RSS feed on the webpage.